Most people watching XRP right now feel like they're standing on a platform staring down the tracks, waiting for a train that keeps getting delayed. Green candle, red candle, nothing happens, repeat. And the longer that goes on, the easier it is to assume that nothing meaningful is actually happening. But that assumption is exactly how people miss structural shifts while they're unfolding. Because while most eyes are locked on short-term price action, something far bigger is moving underneath the surface. A change in how money itself moves around the world. Welcome back to Journey to XRP, and today I want to pull you out of the candle-by-candle mindset, because if you think this conversation is about Ripple winning a lawsuit or catching the next price pump, you're missing the actual story entirely. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why XRP isn't being positioned as just another asset in a portfolio, but as part of the plumbing for a new global financial system, and why that comes with a warning most people are not prepared to hear. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The global payment system you use every day feels modern, but under the hood, it's ancient. The last time you sent money across borders, it probably felt instant. You clicked a button, numbers changed on a screen, and you moved on with your day. But behind that simple action, a mess of outdated processes kicked into gear. Messages bounced between banks, accounts were credited and debited on trust, and the money itself didn't actually move in real time at all. The backbone of this system was designed decades ago. It relies on messaging, not settlement. Banks don't send money to each other when you make a transfer. They send instructions, they reconcile later, and to make that system work, they're forced to lock up enormous amounts of capital in advance, just in case they need it to settle obligations days later. This is what's known as pre-funded liquidity, and it's one of the most inefficient features of modern finance. That inefficiency has a price, not in millions, not in billions, in trillions. Estimates suggest there is roughly $27 trillion sitting idle around the world, frozen in accounts whose only job is to make an outdated system function. That money isn't being invested, it isn't being loaned, it isn't fueling growth, it's just sitting there waiting so transactions can crawl through a process that takes days instead of seconds. Now stop and think about that for a moment. Imagine if even a fraction of that capital was unlocked. Imagine if banks didn't need to pre-position cash everywhere just to move value across borders. That is the shift we're talking about today. And this is where XRP enters the conversation in a way that has nothing to do with hype and everything to do with necessity. There's a massive misunderstanding right now. You'll hear people say Ripple is becoming a retail bank, or that it's trying to compete with your local financial institution. That's nonsense. Ripple doesn't want your savings account. It doesn't care about your debit card. What it's actually doing is far more strategic. It's positioning itself to sit inside the system, not outside it, as a regulated counterparty capable of helping move value at scale. For years, Ripple stood on the sidelines showing banks better tools, but tools alone don't move trillions of dollars. To actually settle money at the core of the system, you have to be part of it. You have to meet regulatory standards. You have to satisfy global banking frameworks. And you have to be trusted to operate where failure is not an option. This is why the story around XRP is so easy to misunderstand if you're only looking at price. What's being built here isn't designed to excite retail traders. It's designed to solve a problem that legacy finance can no longer ignore. And the reason this matters now is because the old system is reaching its limits. In the moving forward, we're going to break down exactly why the current settlement model is broken by design, how concepts like netting and delayed settlement hide inefficiencies from everyday users, and why moving toward instant settlement creates a liquidity problem so big that traditional money alone can't solve it. The reason the system feels functional to you is because it's designed to hide its own inefficiency. When you send money internationally, you're not watching what actually happens. You're watching an interface. Underneath that interface, the process is slow, fragmented, and held together by trust and delay. And the deeper you look, the more obvious it becomes that this model was never built for a real-time global economy. At the center of it all is SWIFT. Despite the name, SWIFT doesn't move money, it moves messages. When Bank A sends money to Bank B, what really happens is that Bank A sends a message instructing Bank B to credit an account. That instruction then ripples through intermediary banks, each one updating its own ledger, each one trusting that the others will settle later. This is why transfers take days, not because technology is slow, but because the system is built on deferred settlement. To make that delay tolerable, banks are forced into a workaround that most people never hear about: nostro and vostro accounts. These are pre-funded accounts that banks hold with each other in foreign jurisdictions. If a bank in New York wants to reliably settle payments with a bank in Tokyo, it has to park large sums of money in advance in Japan. That money just sits there doing nothing, waiting to be used if a payment needs to be settled days later. This is where the scale of the problem becomes clear. Multiply that requirement across every currency pair, every corridor, every major financial institution on Earth. What you get is an enormous pool of trapped capital. Estimates put it at around $27 trillion globally. Not invested, not loaned, not productive, just frozen so the system doesn't break. Banks tolerate this because the alternative has always been worse. Without pre-funded liquidity, the risk of failed settlement rises, and failed settlement is catastrophic in a system built on trust. So instead of modernizing the core, the industry optimized around delay. They batch transactions, they net obligations, they wait. Netting is the quiet trick that makes this whole thing seem acceptable. If Bank A owes Bank B 10 million and Bank B owes Bank A 9 million, they don't move 19 million back and forth. They wait, stack transactions, and eventually settle the 1 million difference. From the bank's perspective, this is efficient. From your perspective, it's invisible. You just see that your money is pending. The problem is that this efficiency comes at your expense. Your transfer is delayed, so balance sheets can be optimized. Your money waits, so liquidity can be conserved. And for decades, that trade-off was accepted because there was no alternative that could handle instant settlement at scale without exploding liquidity requirements. But the world has changed. We now live in an environment where everything else moves in real time: data, communication, markets. The idea that money should take days to move is no longer a technical limitation. It's a structural one. And once you remove the delay, the entire illusion collapses. Because if you settle instantly, netting disappears. You can't wait 3 days to reconcile balances if settlement happens the moment a button is pressed. And if netting disappears, the demand for liquidity doesn't rise gradually. It spikes. Banks suddenly need the full amount of money available immediately. That's the liquidity gap no one wants to talk about. This is why incremental upgrades don't work anymore. Faster messaging doesn't solve a settlement problem. Better interfaces don't unlock trapped capital. You either change the model or you keep freezing trillions of dollars to keep an outdated one alive. And this is the moment we're approaching now. The shift away from delayed settlement isn't optional. It's inevitable. The only question is how that liquidity gap gets filled and what kind of asset can operate in the middle without belonging to any one currency or country. In the moving forward, we're going to look at what happens when instant settlement becomes the goal, why institutions themselves have warned that liquidity demand explodes in that world, and why XRP starts appearing in official frameworks not as a coin, but as a bridge designed to solve this exact problem. To understand why this problem suddenly forces a rethink, you have to look at what happens after instant settlement becomes the goal instead of the exception. Because the moment you remove delay from the system, you expose a flaw that can't be patched with incremental upgrades. You don't just make payments faster. You fundamentally change how liquidity is required to exist in the first place. This is where institutions themselves start raising the alarm. In multiple papers, the International Monetary Fund has warned that as systems move toward real-time and atomic settlement, the demand for liquidity does not increase linearly. It explodes. When every transaction has to settle immediately, banks can no longer rely on netting, batching, or time buffers. They need the full value available at the exact moment of execution. That's a completely different world from the one we've been operating in for decades. Think about what that actually means. In the old model, banks could afford to be inefficient because time was their shock absorber. They could wait, reconcile, and smooth out obligations. In a real-time model, time disappears as a tool. Liquidity has to be there instantly or settlement fails. And failed settlement isn't a minor inconvenience. It's systemic risk. This is why traditional fiat alone can't solve the problem. You can't just tell banks to hold even more idle cash everywhere. That would make the system safer, but at a massive economic cost. Capital would become even less productive. Lending would tighten. Growth would slow. In other words, you'd fix settlement by breaking everything else. So the question becomes unavoidable. How do you enable instant settlement without forcing every participant to pre-fund every possible corridor with massive reserves? That's the question institutions are actually trying to answer, not which coin has the best marketing. This is where automated market makers and neutral bridge assets enter the conversation at a completely different level. than retail DeFi narratives. The Bank for International Settlements has been actively testing models where liquidity pools can be used to facilitate instant exchange between currencies without requiring bilateral pre-funding. Instead of holding money everywhere, you access liquidity when you need it, on demand. In that model, you don't need a direct pool between every currency pair. You need a common bridge, a neutral asset that can sit in the middle, convert instantly, and exit just as fast. That asset doesn't need to be held long term. It needs to be liquid, reliable, and trusted to function under stress. And this is exactly why XRP starts appearing in these frameworks. When XRP is referenced in these contexts, it's not being treated as an investment vehicle. It's being treated as infrastructure, a private settlement asset, a bridge that allows two systems that don't trust each other to transact instantly without freezing capital everywhere. That's a radically different role than most crypto assets are designed to play. This also explains why the language in these reports feels so dry and technical. They're not selling a story, they're solving a constraint. They're comparing mechanisms, not pumping narratives. And the fact that XRP is named at all is significant because these institutions go out of their way to avoid specificity unless something has already been modeled and stress tested. At this point, the picture should be getting clearer. The move toward instant settlement creates a liquidity problem so large that legacy tools can't handle it. The institutions responsible for system stability are openly acknowledging that reality, and they're exploring bridge-based models as a way out. That's the environment XRP is being evaluated in, regardless of what the price chart looks like this week. In the next, we're going to bring this down another layer and explain how Ripple's stablecoin strategy fits into this picture, why RLUSD doesn't replace XRP but actually makes its role clearer, and why regulation is not a side quest here. It's the admission ticket to this entire system. To make sense of what happens next, you have to separate two things that most people keep mixing together: legal settlement and liquidity movement. They are not the same problem, and they are not solved by the same tool. This confusion is exactly why Ripple's strategy looks contradictory to people who are only thinking in coin versus coin terms. Banks care deeply about legal settlement. That's the layer where obligations are recognized, accounts are balanced, and regulators are satisfied. At that level, volatility is poison. No bank wants to settle legal obligations using something that can swing wildly in value between initiation and completion. That's why stable instruments exist and why stablecoins are attractive to institutions in the first place. This is where Ripple's stablecoin strategy comes in. A regulated USD stablecoin gives banks something they are already comfortable with: a dollar-denominated instrument that fits into existing legal and compliance frameworks. It's familiar, it's auditable. It makes lawyers and regulators less nervous. And most importantly, it allows banks to start using Ripple's rails without having to change their internal rulebooks overnight. But here's the part most people miss. Solving the legal settlement layer does not solve the liquidity problem we just talked about. Even if a bank uses a stablecoin to settle obligations, it still faces the same issue the moment it wants to move value across borders instantly. The liquidity still has to come from somewhere. The timing problem still exists. Netting still disappears in an atomic settlement world. This is where XRP's role becomes clearer, not weaker. XRP is not there to replace the dollar or compete with a stablecoin. It's there to do the one thing stablecoins cannot do efficiently at scale: act as a neutral, on-demand liquidity bridge between currencies without requiring pre-funded accounts everywhere. The stablecoin satisfies the legal layer. XRP satisfies the liquidity layer. Different jobs, same system. Think of it like this. The stablecoin is the paperwork that makes the transaction acceptable. XRP is the engine that actually moves the value across the gap. One makes the transaction compliant, the other makes it possible without freezing trillions of dollars in advance. Remove either one and the system breaks. This is also why regulation suddenly matters so much. You cannot sit at the center of global settlement flows unless you are allowed to. It doesn't matter how good the technology is. If you are not recognized as a legitimate counterparty, you are locked out of the highest value corridors. That's why Ripple spent years fighting for clarity instead of avoiding regulators. They weren't trying to win a popularity contest. They were trying to earn the right to participate when the system transitions. At this stage, we're no longer talking about pilots for fun. The institutions driving these conversations have made it clear that the experimentation phase is ending. Systems are being evaluated against hard criteria: reliability, scalability, neutrality, and compliance. Anything that doesn't meet those standards will be filtered out, regardless of how loud its community is or how exciting its price action looks. And this is where the warning comes in. As the system moves from experimentation to deployment, the field narrows dramatically. Assets that were fine in a sandbox environment don't necessarily survive contact with real-world settlement requirements. The barrier to entry rises, the tolerance for risk drops. Only mechanisms that can operate under regulation, stress, and scale remain viable. In the last, we're going to tie all of this together and talk about what this transition phase actually means for positioning and expectations, why this kind of shift never looks obvious in real time, and how most people get filtered out not because they're wrong, but because they misunderstand what phase we're actually in. When you step back and connect everything we've walked through, the picture becomes a lot clearer and a lot less comfortable. What's happening right now isn't a hype cycle, it's a filtering event. For years, crypto existed in a pilot phase where almost anything could survive. Projects could launch, claim utility, run small tests, and live off narratives. That phase is ending. The system is moving from experimentation to deployment, and deployment does not tolerate ambiguity. This is the phase where infrastructure gets chosen, not because it's popular, but because it works under pressure. Regulation, liquidity efficiency, neutrality, and scalability stop being buzzwords and start being hard requirements. Anything that can't meet them quietly falls away, not with drama, not with announcements, just by being excluded from the real flows of value. That's why this shift never looks obvious in real time. The loud signals, price spikes, viral narratives, influencer conviction matter less than the quiet ones. Policy papers, settlement frameworks, liquidity experiments, regulatory classification. These are the places where the future gets decided long before the market agrees on a story. This is also why most people feel unsettled right now. The market isn't giving easy feedback. Price isn't validating beliefs on demand. And when that happens, people assume something is wrong. In reality, this is exactly what transition phases feel like. The old system hasn't fully broken yet, and the new one isn't fully visible. That in-between state creates boredom, doubt, and impatience. And those emotions are what filter people out. The mistake isn't being cautious. The mistake is misunderstanding what caution actually means here. Caution doesn't mean reacting to every headline or abandoning a thesis because price stalled. It means continuously checking whether the underlying structure still makes sense. Are the problems real? Are institutions acknowledging them? Are viable solutions being tested at scale? If those answers stay yes, then discomfort alone isn't a signal to exit. At the same time, nothing here is guaranteed. No system transition is predetermined. Competing standards exist. Political incentives change. Adoption can slow. Being clear-eyed means acknowledging that risk without turning uncertainty into paralysis. This isn't about certainty, it's about alignment between what you think you're holding and the phase the system is actually in. The biggest trap most people fall into is waiting for something to feel obvious. By the time it does, the asymmetry is gone. Infrastructure only feels obvious after it's already embedded. Before that, it feels dull, slow, and underwhelming. That's not a flaw. That's the cost of being early to structural change instead of late to consensus. So the real question isn't whether this $27 trillion shift happens tomorrow or next year. The real question is whether you understand what's being built well enough to avoid confusing silence with failure, because the system doesn't announce when it's choosing its foundations. It just builds on them and moves on. And before we close, it's important to be absolutely clear about this. This content is not financial advice. It is not a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any asset. Crypto markets are volatile, complex, and unpredictable. You are responsible for your own decisions. Always do your own research, understand your risk tolerance, and never rely on someone else's conviction instead of building your own.